So this is kind of the introduction for a new conversation around international political economy, and we'll be rolling out a couple different pieces related to trade and related to sort of the global currency system and related to economic development and efforts to alleviate poverty globally. But I want to start with laying out some concepts and some vocabulary, and then talking sort of in a big picture about how we think states go about achieving growth, or how we might think about that question about economic growth. And so I'll just start by saying this is kind of not a new question. It's an age-old question. It's sort of the animating question for Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. For a good chunk of the post-Cold War period, we talked about this idea of development using this typology of first world, second world, third world. To think about not just sort of level of development, how wealthy countries were, but how they got there. And so first world referred to countries that had used a capitalist mode of industrialization and had seen standards of living rise quite high. The third world referred to places that hadn't yet gone through a process of industrialization and remained relatively poor. And the second world referred to countries that had pursued a top-down or statist model of industrialization. So specifically the Soviet Union, which had used the power of the state to kind of reorganize the Russian economy and achieved, at that point, the fastest industrialization the world had ever seen. And so the question was, and it was sort of implicit in the Cold War, which path to industrialization would countries in the third world pursue? Would they pursue the capitalist free market model that the West used to become wealthy, or would they choose the top-down statist model that the Soviet Union had used to industrialize very, very rapidly? And that was sort of the animating question around development in the Cold War. But after 1989, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the clear disparities that became obvious between countries in the first world and the second world, that typology, that way of thinking about and talking about wealth and poverty just didn't make as much sense. And so we've moved on to a different kind of typology that's really rooted in GDP per capita, GDP, gross domestic product, sum total of everything your economy's cranking out in a given year, and then per capita is per person, because capita is Latin for head, so per head. And so typically today we talk about this in terms of high income, upper middle income, and low income states. And so when we're thinking about high income states, we're talking about countries globally that have GDP per capitas of over $13,000. Again, per capita. This covers Western Europe and covers the United States, a number of the Asian tiger economies, Japan, South Korea, Canada would also fall under the sort of high income states. Typically, these are countries that have gone through a process of industrialization and are maybe transitioning to a post-industrial economy built around services as the primary bulk of sort of where the economy is oriented. Upper middle income states are maybe in that range of 4,000-ish to 13,000-ish. They are oftentimes going through a process of transitioning to manufacturing, maybe gaining a little bit of expertise in that area, so they're producing more technical, more sophisticated, more capital-intensive kinds of manufacturing. Many countries that sort of emerge out of that second world industrialization process are sort of in this range as well, so Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Lower middle income states are in the range of 1,000 to 4,000. Their economies tend to be primarily built around agriculture and commodity export. So they're growing things, they're pulling things out of the ground, and they're pushing them out into international markets. And that corresponds more or less with what we would talk about in the old typology as third world countries that haven't yet gone through a process of industrialization that's raised standards of living. There's a little bit of a quirk here in talking about sort of the mode or the production patterns in an economy, and then conflating that with a country's GDP, because some countries have commodities that they can pull out of the ground that are incredibly in demand, like oil or natural gas, and have a relatively small population, so that they can push those commodities out and achieve very high standards of living or very high GDP per capita. And so these rentier states or oil-rich states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait would be all examples, the United Arab Emirates, of countries that are able to achieve very high GDPs with essentially this commodity extraction model. And then we have our low-income states of under $1,000 GDP per capita, and in that range, we're really talking about some of the poorest of the poor globally, and that encompasses not just a handful of states that are at that sort of poor extreme, but it also encompasses roughly 2 billion people globally who make less than $1,000 a year or $2 a day, and 1 billion of those people live on less than $1 a day, which is a striking and shocking level of poverty. And I want to maybe dig into that a little bit and talk about how that's even possible. And it gets at some of the limits of GDP as a measurement tool. So GDP, gross domestic product, is the total sum of goods produced by a country and services produced by a country in a given year, but it really only captures the formal economy. So it doesn't capture things that are happening below, under the table. So when I hire a landscaping company to mow my lawn, I'm generating GDP, or GDP is being generated because of that transaction. When I hire a kid down the block to mow my lawn and I pay him in cash, that's technically not generating GDP because it's not being reported as part of the formal economy. Heck, if I mow my lawn myself, that exact same action of mowing the lawn doesn't produce any GDP. And so there's lots of things that if we do them for ourselves, we're still creating the value. It's just not being picked up in that measure. And there's lots of things that sort of fall into this category. Illicit criminal activity, sale of drugs, aren't going to be picked up in GDP numbers. And so there's maybe some pushback. People who are engaging in subsistence agriculture, they're growing a garden to supplement their ability to feed themselves and their family, that activity isn't going to be picked up in GDP. And so that's maybe part of the story about how people can live on $1 a day, but I think it's also worth recognizing that people don't live on $1 a day. They die on $1 a day. That infant mortality rates are incredibly high in the poorest of the poor parts of the world. Life expectancy is low, and there are incredible struggles that come at that income range that we'll talk about in a little bit more length and depth when we talk about economic development and different approaches to economic development. But before we get there, I want to flag one additional thing that is, I think, important to recognize in those numbers. And so economists have long differentiated between GDP as sort of this dollar value measure of how much you can buy and sell of something, from GDP purchasing power parity, which separates out sort of the global picture about buying and selling and the cost of things from the cost of things in the local economy. And so this becomes really important where countries have different labor costs, because there are some things that are going to be basically the same price everywhere on the planet. Things like steel, right? If you want to buy steel, there's a global market in steel, there's a global price in steel, and you're going to pay for that plus demand plus shipping costs, and that's basically what everybody's going to pay. But other things are not sold on a global market. Other things are sold on a local market, things like haircuts. And the price of a haircut depends not on global demand for haircuts, but in your local market, what do the labor conditions look like? And within countries, the price of a haircut can vary considerably. Urban centers, the haircuts tend to be more expensive than in rural areas where property values are lower, incomes are maybe lower as well, and so overall the value for the cost or the price for those services reflects that. But between countries, we can see really big differences in labor costs. And so purchasing power parity tries to capture those differences in labor costs and talk about GDP not just in terms of how much you're producing, but if you had to buy a market basket of goods and services, things that were sort of a mix of goods and services, how much would that cost in different countries to get that same identical collection of goods and services, which is a little abstract way of talking about it, but I think there's maybe a more plausibly intuitive way of talking about this. This is the Big Mac Index that the Economist magazine has long put out as a way to try to communicate this idea of purchasing power parity. And their thesis is that a Big Mac is the perfect example of a market basket of goods and services, right? It's a standardized product that exists around the world, and we can get pricing data on around the world, and it contains things that are commodities like, the wheat that goes into the bun, the lettuce, the tomatoes, the meat. All of that is going to be traded on global markets, but you also have the assembly, right? Somebody has to put this thing together, you have to do the ordering and all of that, and so the labor costs are also reflected in the Big Mac. And what we find is that the price of the Big Mac varies considerably. In terms of US dollars, it goes from basically $2 at the lower end in Venezuela, Romania, and Indonesia, to close to $7 or $6.70 in countries like Norway and Switzerland. And so the argument is that those differences in price reflect purchasing power parity, that it's the labor component that's driving those differences primarily, and that this is a way of thinking about how a dollar of GDP can look very different in terms of what you can get from it from one economy to another. I think this is kind of important, particularly when you're comparing and contrasting wealthy countries that have relatively high labor costs with countries that are much poorer, where labor costs are much lower, because their economies may be able to produce comparable market baskets of goods, even though their GDP per capita look differently. And so there's actually an argument that China has already well surpassed the United States in terms of the size of its economy, if you think about it from this market basket perspective of goods and services, and consider it from the perspective of purchasing power parity, while the United States continues to lead in terms of just a straight real GDP that uses a single pricing for things around the world. Okay, I'm going way too much into depth on purchasing power parity. I'm going to pivot now and talk a little bit about how do we go about increasing GDP. And there's a couple different things, and this conversation is largely from the perspective of states. If you're a state thinking about what kind of policy levers you could pull to try to get your economy larger, more GDP, there's a couple things you could try. So one is to try to increase your population. Immigration or pro-natal policies could be one way to go. This tends not to be the route that countries pursue exclusively, because increasing your population doesn't necessarily make your population more well off in terms of GDP per capita, even if the overall economy grows, because you have more people cranking out stuff at the same rate. It's maybe not an immediate path to prosperity. A second approach is to try to get the population you have to be able to be more efficient, and so that could be technology, right? So if you ask me to write something and give me a pen and paper, I'm going to be relatively slow. If you give me a typewriter, I'm going to be faster. If you give me a word processor, I'm going to be faster still. Increased technology can increase the efficiency that any individual is able to provide in terms of producing stuff. Education also can do that, right? So teaching me to type is really valuable in terms of helping me to actually crank out papers and reports and documents and generate those sorts of things. Likewise, skills in data analysis or visualization, all the other things I've been taught, or I sometimes teach, in theory make you more efficient at doing those kind of administrative research tasks. Likewise, we train up people on assembly lines and electricians and all sorts of professions and jobs. There's training that we think will make you more efficient and more able to crank out GDP, although we oftentimes don't talk about it in those terms. And then finally, we could think about getting people to be more efficient by organizing them in a more efficient way, right? So if we started with a room full of car parts and a room, in a pile, and a pile of tools, and said, here, let's build a car collectively together. And we spent a lot of time, wandering over, looking for the right part and looking for the right tool and figuring out where they go. That's a really inefficient way to build a car. Henry Ford figured out if you put an assembly line together, give everybody one tool and a stack of one parts, you can move the car along the assembly line. Everybody knows, okay, I take the part, I put it here, I do the thing with the tool, and you get much greater efficiency for the same amount of workers trying to do things. So we can think about making individuals more efficient, but we can also think about making the economy itself more efficient. And there's a couple ways that this could be thought of. So one of those would be to reduce red tape or restrictions on businesses that make it difficult to operate. This is something that Hernando de Soto kind of famously dug into. He was teaching a master's level class in economics in Peru, and he assigned to his class the task of starting a business. It was, and they said, oh, that'll be easy. He said, no, start a business, but no bribes. And so you have to stand in line, you have to get the forms filed, you have to do all the paperwork, and no bribes. And over the course of the semester, the class, working collectively, couldn't get the business started. And so economists have tracked this, like how long does it take on average to start a business? And global data on this, I think it looks like import-export businesses that the World Bank collects, suggests that the global average is about 55 days. 55 days of full 8 hours standing in line, which is a crushing level of bureaucracy that slows down productivity in an economy. If you're curious, if you're in the United States, what the bureaucratic picture looks like, I believe the duration is about 5 days to get all the paperwork filed. So there's considerable variation in terms of what those bureaucratic costs look like. I'll give you an example of how this can play out. When a number of years ago, I hired a friend to do some work for me, and I went to the IRS website because my father was a tax investigator, and told me, like, you will do this above board. And I was like, oh, of course, Dad. And I went to the IRS website and I looked, hiring your first employee, and there was like a frequently asked questions, and it said, you're thinking about hiring your first employee. I said, yes, I am. And I clicked on it, and it said, don't. It said, do not take this step if you can avoid it. Work longer hours, press children into labor, turn down business, do whatever you can to avoid hiring that first employee, because your administrative load of managing and complying and filing paperwork is going to go from here to here, and this is not a step to be taken lightly. Okay? Those kind of administrative constraints affect people's calculations about all sorts of things in economics, and contribute collectively to what we talk about when we talk about the efficiency of an economy. Another way you can make your economy more efficient is to make transactions transparent and predictable. It's kind of amorphous. Transactions, doing business with people, transparent and predictable. I guess the way I would explain this is that most people, when they go to fill a car with gas, don't get out a gallon jug. I guess a liter jug if you're in a non-US part of the world. And fill it up with gas to check, okay, is this gas pump giving me a gallon, and then siphoning the gallon into their tank. Most people just put the hose nozzle thingy into the tank and pull the lever and watch the number spin, and just trust that when the pump says that you've pumped 15 gallons of gas, that there are now 15 gallons of gas in your tank. But you have no way of knowing, you have no way of verifying that, and yet we don't typically go through that process of like double checking every single thing. And part of that is gets at this idea of making transactions transparent and predictable. And so part of that is, the rule of law, part of that is contract enforcement, part of that is regulation, part of that is just the fact that in my state of North Dakota, there's a Department of Weights and Measures that goes around to gas pumps and checks and puts a sticker and says this pump on this date was tested, and it measures out a gallon of gas. When it says it's measuring out a gallon of gas, this pump is certified and works. And so we don't even have to think about that. And when you compound all of those things that we go through our lives doing, all those transactions and interactions where we could potentially be cheated a little bit, but we don't even double check because we just sort of trust that things will be okay, collectively, all that really adds up. And so it's one of the things that we think helps make an economy run more efficiently is that we don't have to waste time double checking every little thing. And then finally, when we're thinking about how to get your economy to be more efficient, we have this idea of comparative advantage. And I'm not going to talk about comparative advantage at much length here because we'll have a whole other conversation on it. But it's essentially figuring out what your place is in the global economy where you can contribute in a way that allows for us all collectively to maximize our overall input. And so we think that the way that you find your comparative advantage within the global economy is by participating in a global system of trade, and market forces will kind of push countries toward the place that they're producing the things that will allow for everyone globally to have collectively more stuff and have the global economy collectively run more efficiently. And so like I said, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about comparative advantage, but that is kind of where that fits within our larger conversation about how you go about increasing GDP.